The word closest in meaning to hegemony, as used in the third paragraph, would be. The word is used here. This statement says, as a consequence, however, the South is incapable of escaping the North's cultural hegemony, for development without hegemony is like a race without direction. The reason is given actually across the passage, but in the previous lines, in the preceding lines of this very paragraph. So the lines from here to here, these actually give us the reason. The passage repeatedly establishes North as being much more powerful and having a lot more resources, and the South being dependent on the North. We see it particularly in these lines. If it was along these lines that they succeeded after the lost decade of the 1980s in putting back the North-South division squarely on the international agenda, the spotlight was thus largely focused on the North's willingness to come up with $125 billion of yearly assistance to fulfill its long overdue promise of allocating 0.7% of its GNP to development aid to provide clean technologies or access to bioindustrial patents. On this diplomatic level, this was hardly surprising. For most of the third world, trapped by the failure of the politics of catching up, fears that the world will eternally be split between the North's super economy and the South's wretched economies. So we see that in particular, this reference, the North's super economy and the South's wretched economies, this suggests that the North is much more powerful, much more established, developed, and the South, there's a reference, there's a suggestion that the South actually talks about the third world countries. Might or might not be true in real life, in common knowledge, but that is something that the passage does not explain to us. What does the passage mean when it says the North, the South? We don't know. We don't need it to answer any questions. We should not need it. So we find that the North is much more powerful and the South much weaker, not weaker, but then wretched, much more poor. And thus it can be assumed, or it is mentioned, that the South is dependent on the North. We see it in this statement also. Skip one line, one statement, move further. In fact, the Rio documents make clear that the South has no intention of abandoning the Northern model of living as its implicit utopia. Notice the phrase implicit utopia. So the South, it follows the Northern model of living as an implicit utopia, which suggests that the North is a utopia. The South emulates that, but the South has been, or the economy of the South has been established as wretched. So we cannot say that the South is utopian at all. In using the language of development, the South continues to subscribe to the notion that the North shows the way for the rest of the world. In all of this, we find that the word hegemony actually suggests that the North is extremely powerful, much more powerful and rich than the South, and that makes the South dependent upon the North in many aspects. There is a North-South divide, there is a North-South gap, division, which exists, yes, but despite that, the South is rather demanding of the North, and that we can see from the second paragraph. Let's not go there. We have enough information to answer the question. Option A says position. So just cultural position for development without position makes no sense. We see that it is much more than that. There's a position of strength in the word hegemony. So position is extremely generalized. It doesn't take the connotation into consideration. It just says position, which is a neutral word. While here we see an aspect of, as we have discussed, a connotation of strength and power. So A is incorrect. Option B says configuration. Configuration has no connection whatsoever. Cultural configuration, the setup of things, the cultural setup, no connection. We are looking for power. We're looking for resources, a higher level of power, a higher level of resources. So B doesn't work at all. Option C tells us dominion. Dominion is perfect. Dominion basically means rule. And we see it's not necessarily rule, though. It is more like the North has power over the South, and the South depends upon the North for many things. It tries to emulate the utopia that North is. It demands help from the North, and it subscribes to the notion that the North shows the way for the rest of the world. So there is some sort of power and advantage of the North over the South. So while dominion means rule, it doesn't necessarily mean rule. What it means more is essentially a word which is very similar to this, somewhat similar to this, but in this context, it would be almost synonymous. That is domination. So it is that the North has domination over the South, to the point that it is almost like the North shows the way, it rules, while the South follows. So there is a kind of a savior follower, such a dynamic in the relation between the North and the South. So we find that option C is a valid choice. Option D says protectorate. Now, protectorate, uncommon word, but it still doesn't have anything in common here. It has no connection. A protectorate is a state or a nation which is protected or governed remotely, not without its own government. It is governed and hence protected by another state or nation. So, for example, Cuba was a protectorate of the US for a very long time, till about the 1990s. So protectorate is not what we are talking about. We are not talking about protection or even governance. We are talking about a position of power, a position of superiority, hegemony, dominance, dominion even, not protection. So D is out. That is incorrect. The correct answer is option C.